hello, and welcome to another episode. I'm so excited to be here with you, lovelies. I have a very special guest with me today. We're going to be talking with Deborah Fox about all things sexuality for couples and partners who want to make their sex life better. So, whether you're having sexual difficulties, whether you want to rekindle your romance and your fun time, sexy time, or you just are feeling that you're not having enough of it. So, we're going to figure out how to get into having a better sex life with your partner. I'm going to pick Deborah's brain today, and she's going to shed some light for us to improve our intimacy with our partner. Stay tuned. You're in for a treat. So, welcome. I'm so excited to have Deborah Fox with us today. I am going to read her bio and then I'll say hello to Deborah. So, Deborah Fox is a clinical social worker with over 35 years' experience in private practice in the Washington, D.C. area. She's a certified imago therapist and a certified sex therapist, providing individual, couple, and group psychotherapy as well as clinical consultation. Deborah lectures on the integration of mind-body strategies into couples therapy, sex therapy, and the treatment of sexual trauma, as well as conducting a small group seminars and consultation groups. Her most recent publication is the integration of somatic-based strategies into couples therapy, published in the Clinical Social Work Journal last year. You're welcome to visit Deborah at her website at debfox.com. So happy to have you with me today. Deborah, how are you?
I'm great. It's my pleasure to be here.
I am so excited for this conversation. Very needed. A lot of people have questions and wonderings about intimacy and sexuality. So hopefully we could put a lot of those myths and questions to rest.
Of course.
Yes. Okay. So first, tell us a little bit about who Deborah is and what brings you to this work.
Yes. So I have been practicing a very long time. I think what brought me to this work was really my interest in people, in their stories, what made people tick, what made them who they are,
Yeah.
and certainly what their life stories happen to them and brings them to this point in life, and what could make them less distressed.
Yes, very nice. And so you work in the Washington, D.C. area and you specialize in working with couples and you're all sex and couples things.
Yes, that is true.
Terrific. Very, very good. So let's jump right in. I am thinking, why don't we start with how do people experience themselves? What's going on within themselves that they might be bringing to the relationship that contributes to difficulties with sexuality or really enjoying their sex life?
Yes. So some of it is what we bring just as individuals and our life experience. And then a lot of what really suffers is that we don't have a lot of sexuality education in our culture, in our families, in our relationships. That's terribly useful. And so a lot of couples are really just struggling with not knowing. And one of the big things I'll say about that is there are different sexual styles, for example.
Mm,
This is not common knowledge outside the sex therapy universe. Now it is. Fortunately, there have been some books published finally, so that information, so there's so much life experience, good experiences, bad experiences, as well as information that is sorely needed.
absolutely. So, what, aside from the pleasure that the body seeks when we're having intimacy, and sex is not just about bodily pleasure, right? So, we could maybe get into that a little bit as well.
Mhm.
But what is happening with the body that might actually get in the way of starting on a good path toward a good sex life?
Mhm. So people grow up with so many different experiences about their relationship with their own body.
Hmm.
Many people don't grow up feeling good about their body. If they receive comments, particularly in their families, that they're too skinny, they're too fat, they're too, short, or whatever it might be, is that information really becomes ingrained. And we hold a lot of information in our body that we don't necessarily even know is there. And if I can introduce a technical word called implicit memory, that
Yes.
this is very powerful when it comes to sexuality. And just a simple way to explain what implicit memory is that let's say you're 5 years old and you were hit by a red truck.
Mm,
You survived, you're fine, you recover. Now you're 35 and you're standing on a street corner just waiting to cross the street and traffic's going by and a red truck goes by and your body flinches.
yeah.
Your body, your implicit memory, is remembering that you were hit by a red truck and that
Mm,
that hurt. But consciously, you're just watching the traffic go by.
yeah.
So we hold this information, or just like you can get on a bicycle. You haven't ridden a bicycle in 15 years, but you don't have to think, oh, how do I ride a bicycle? Your body remembers. Well, our bodies also remember bad experience and hopefully good experience too. But unfortunately, in this case, we're talking about bad experience. Certainly, people who have been made uncomfortable in some way about their body. It can be as simple as, let's say you're a girl who's just come into puberty and you're somewhat self-conscious and you have an older relative, who comments in some way, uh, in my view, of course, inappropriate to comment on her developing body.
Yes.
And she is, so embarrassed. Time goes on and she kind of forgets that that happened, but her body remembers that. And so she's very self-conscious about her body.
Yeah, I'm actually feeling that because I've heard stories like this and I have similar stories of my own, of course.
Mhm.
So yeah, for sure. Just the messaging, the experiences, and not just related to the body and sex per se, but just all kinds of life experiences like you were talking about the bicycle and the red truck, right? So
Mhm.
anything that might feel like traumatic or not comfortable gets stored, right? This is this
Yes.
memory. And then it plays a role in our ability to relax and be comfortable. And right, how does it
Yes.
affect us? So I want you to tell us more about that.
Yes. So often what happens is that people can be uncomfortable in a sexual interaction, but they don't necessarily know why.
Yeah.
And it can be as alarming as, don't touch me there, a really powerful response.
Mm,
And, or it can be, I'm just kind of uncomfortable with the lights on and, I really want to be under the sheets at all times.
right.
So it can be, really explosive or very subtle. And these things tend to have a lot of lasting ability because we don't know how to solve them, except to avoid something that's uncomfortable, like always having sex in the dark with the lights out and the shades drawn, so to speak. So yes, so
Right.
many things are recorded. And I use a pretty minor example, but of course there are many situations of sexual abuse and really overt assaults that have a very powerful effect that are stored in the body too. Now, in many cases, we do remember them consciously, not always.
Right.
So we know they're there when that's the case, but it still can affect us. It's not like we therefore can just throw it off and get rid of it.
Right. It's interesting too because I mean, with the work that I do with couples, it's very obvious, or part of the work that we do is one partner wants more sex than the other, or more intimacy than the other, more touch, more affection. The other one has no interest, or they have a hard
Mhm.
time. They want to, of course, but they don't prefer it, or they struggle.
Mhm.
And just they're not being touched even, right? Like just even basic affection is challenging for some people that might have histories of either some sex situations or just in general, just receiving weird messages that talk about your body or your selfhood. Period.
Mhm.
Any message, right? As we
Mhm.
know. Yeah, very good. So thank you for that. So, what do you think are other things then that contribute to people not being interested in being touched or not being interested in intimacy, sex, or have low desire?
Yes. So one of the most common things that will bring couples into any therapist's office is really what we call desire discrepancy, where one partner, wants more, usually more frequent sex. Now, sometimes it can also be, different, sexual behaviors for sure,
Right.
but just in terms of the frequency, it's so, so common. And here's where some education really is important because I'll go into other factors, but this one is just not common enough knowledge, which
Mm.
is sexual styles. There are two big sexual styles. One is spontaneous, the other is called responsive. And spontaneous sexual style is what we know the most about. This is the person who is just walking down the street and, every sixth thought is about something sexual. They just have an internal engine that easily they feel desire. It just pops up, or they have a thought, or they see a person that they're attracted, or, they see a sign, just that some of us might not react to.
Hmm.
And spontaneous sexual desire is and it's what we see in the media. It's what we see in the movies. This is where people are dropping their clothes, and as soon as they walk in the door, and the sex is hot and passionate in 5 seconds.
Right.
That's what we're familiar with.
Mhm.
But that is not represented by everybody. So an equally large group is represented by something we call responsive desire. And this is the one that's not in the movies. And this responsive desire people are those who don't particularly walk around with that internally charged engine that just, pops up naturally. They are more inclined to where arousal might actually come first before desire. And what that means is this question of I'm not in the mood is the wrong question. The
Right.
question is, oh, am I open and willing to engage in physical touch? And when I am touched or I am touching, then some inklings of arousal might show up. And oh, I am very glad to be here doing this. And so desire shows up. But let me back up a moment because these are the folks where the context is crucial. So context meaning, are they fatigued? Are they preoccupied with a work deadline or a project?
Mm.
Or they have a family member who's maybe struggling or ill, or, there's one of their children is, on their mind because of some problem that needs to be addressed. All these are contextual issues.
Right.
And for a spontaneous person, these might be just factors. But for a responsive person, these are central, these are decisive.
Right.
And so we don't know about responsive sexual style. And even the people who fall into that category, they've never known about it because it's not talked about,
Right.
except for books in recent years, thank goodness,
Mhm.
that are certainly bring this information. So most couples, and this can be true in my experience, even with same gendered couples, usually have one representative from each group. Now, Emily Nagoski in her book Come As You Are, Emily's a sexuality researcher, she gives some statistics, and which I think are interesting, that there are some nuances to this, but I'll give you the bottom line, which is about 75% of men are in the spontaneous sexual style, which would fit with what I think we commonly know.
Right.
And about 25% of men would be in the responsive category. And then for women, it's flipped, where,
Of
and here's
course.
where there's nuances, but there's about 85% who would fall into that responsive category.
Hmm.
Now, the really goofy thing about this is that in dating, in the early stages of infatuation, this is when most couples tend, not everybody, but tend to be the most interested. And so the spontaneous people, that's their happy place. And the responsive people, they look more spontaneous during that time because
Right.
we're creatures of novel and new and infatuation. There's all sorts of hormones coursing through our bodies. And so in a couple that ends up staying together long term, that naturally fades. That's biology. But we very confused by that. The spontaneous person saying, what happened to my partner who wanted to have sex with me all the time? Suddenly, it's important that there's food in the refrigerator that didn't used to be. Or
That's
being
awesome.
late to work, that's not a problem. Now it's important to not be late to work, to stay home and have sex.
Mm,
So, and the responsive people are also confused because nobody knows what quite happened and they don't know what to do at that point. And so that's where just a lot of unnecessary suffering comes into play. So let me
sure.
just pause there for a moment and see, does that sort of make sense so far?
Yes, I love the distinction because it makes total sense. I mean, I see it what's the word, anecdotally, and I see it with the stories that I hear from our couples and just the experiences, right? That usually one person, like we were saying before we started recording, wants more than the other. And just the
Mm-hmm.
frequency plays out, and it's probably part of this definition as well. I assume that the spontaneous person probably wants more, or it seems that they will be more interested in more
Yes.
frequent sex because they have that engine revving. With the other one, they
Yes.
need to line up all the stars to
Right.
be able to be ready, right? That's how I joke about it sometimes.
Right. And there's things that couples can do about this. I mean, the spontaneous people, they can be helpful, in terms of helping to create that context.
Right.
And the responsive person also needs to think of, well, what can I do to sort of clear the decks
That's right.
so I can be open to
Mhm.
touching, and then they can work together as a team. If let's say they have children and the spontaneous person can say, hey, I'll put the kids to bed and I'll do the dishes, which maybe will give you time to chill out, relax, read your favorite magazine, and be more open to engaging in touch. So this is just a huge thing that if people know about and they really take seriously. Now, the taking seriously is kind of a, a point to emphasize here because when I explain responsive desire to a spontaneous person,
Mhm.
their jaws drop. They just cannot imagine that their partner doesn't walk down the street and just have spontaneous sexual desire. They live on a foreign planet.
Right.
And the responsive person, when you explain the spontaneous style to them, it's the same jaw dropping experience. You're kidding. They
Right.
do that.
Right.
And the responsive person also has their wide eyed look because that's me. You have just explained my experience that I never knew was a thing. I just
Right.
thought something was wrong with me.
Aw,
And so both partners think something's wrong with the responsive person, and which is just such a shame.
totally.
Such a shame.
Yes. Yes, for sure. And I love that you said that it doesn't have to be a problem or a thing, right? They could do something about
Mm.
it. And I love the
Yes.
example that you gave that the spontaneous person kind of helps set up the context, right? So, what are the things that would help the other person? Whatever are the things that are bothering the person or getting in the way? How can they help with those things so that the other person is not so loaded with all the things that keep them from being ready and available? Yes.
Yes, and everybody talks their own language. So, like the spontaneous person is often saying to their responsive partner, well, tell me what turns you on. And they're thinking of sexual behaviors because
Right.
that's what their frame of reference. And
Right.
because they have no idea about how important the context is. And so there's just this constant missing of communication around these kinds of things.
For sure. And that's so interesting that you said it like that because also the other thing is not only they're looking for what turns you on sexually, but then they're looking for like, okay, and what else can we do? And it's the whole thing is sexual, right? It's not just like a position or a thing, but like everything is sexual context when the other person sex is at the bottom of the list. All the other context needs to be
Right.
addressed first.
Yes, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And couples do need to prioritize their relationship, because it does fall off the priority list when, jobs are full time and more than full time and or they have children who come along,
Yeah.
and it just falls off. We put everything else on our calendar, but we don't put sex on our calendar. That's kind of odd, but people
That
are
cracks
people.
me up. That cracks me up because whenever I bring up scheduled sex, people freak out. And I say, listen, if you're not having it at least once a week, then you need to schedule it. At least the first one. I'm not telling you not to have more than that. Then the rest could be spontaneous, but at least have the one. Very
It's
good.
true.
So, any thoughts about what might be different for women whose biology is a little bit slower to rev up and to enjoy the moment? So, anything
Hmm.
about that? One, and two, the discrepancy with orgasming or different ways that the woman can orgasm to make it easier, because the typical traditional thing, the person who gets off easier might think that the other person will get off just as easily, and that's just usually not the case, right? And I'm trying to use proper language. um,
Yes, yes. And let me say one thing before that, and then
sure.
I'll make sure I'll get to that, which is another thing that is so important is about discomfort and pain.
Mm,
And the reason I want to put this in there, it's another thing that there are different conditions, physiological conditions
mhm,
that create pain for women. And the reason I'm mentioning it in the context of your question, which I will answer, is that often women do not know that it's we're not supposed to have any pain. And so, because they've always had it, for example, where it's just evolved and they don't realize
right.
that there is a problem. And often there's enough physicians are not really properly educated or and don't ask the right questions and don't know what to look for, so that women suffer unnecessarily for pain, vaginal pain, either internally, the muscles sometimes can be too tight, which create a condition.
Hmm.
And therefore, that leads to not wanting to engage in sex, of course, because we don't go towards pain.
Right.
And some of these things can interfere with orgasm. So it's really important that if a woman is saying, or a couple, it's hard to get to arousal and climbing that arousal ladder to an orgasm, it's super important to be really talking about the physiological things that might be going on. I'll give you just one example because women don't know this one either typically, and sometimes doctors don't, unfortunately,
Mm,
is that there can be some scar tissue that develops under the clitoral hood,
mm,
um, and it can interfere with pleasure. And if a woman isn't saying that, and the doctor doesn't know what to look for, then she's really not in a position. She can, you know, have the most amazing partner or the most amazing toys or whatever, and her sensations are going to be very muted.
yes,
So
what a good observation or share, because and they might not even know that something's wrong, that they have scar tissue there. That they just
exactly.
this is their experience, right? This is what sex
Yes.
is like, right? How do they even know?
Yes.
That's amazing. Yes, thank you for that.
Yes. Yes, so
Very
super
good.
important. And that's where knowing a sexual medicine physician, which
Yes.
not all gynecologists or urologists are, is super important.
Right.
Um, and so to get to the next part of your question is, yes, often women do have a slower climb on that arousal level
Mhm.
than men do. And some of it is about the context. If there are, some flirty text messages that have gone back and forth, or there's some playfulness, or they're reading, I don't know, some erotic literature together, beforehand. That's a lot of priming the pump. And as we all know, the largest sexual organ is the one between our ears.
Mhm.
And so some of these things are very, very important. And the other thing is we have lots of erogenous zones that are not the most obvious. So a lot of touching is can be very arousing. and I like to call this a to and fro. So what it means is, if you're rubbing somebody's back and then your hand goes towards erogenous zones and then it goes back down the arms and then comes back to erogenous zones, that these kinds of things, that anticipatory touch can be very arousing because so often, especially in with a spontaneous person, they might just dive for erogenous
Yeah,
zones
they're
because
just ready
that's
to
what they
go.
would like.
Right.
The funniest example, and there's many versions of this, but a woman will say, he just comes up behind me while I'm doing the dishes and puts his hands on my breasts and I'll elbow him in the stomach. And and he thinks he's doing something that is, very appealing. And if she asks him, he'll say, like, if she were to say, well, do you want me to come up and just grab your crotch? He'll say, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So people need to get to know each other. We're talking about heterosexual couples here. They
Yeah.
who are different styles and different genders. They need to get to know each other in ways that we don't, unfortunately. So yes, so that anticipatory touch of spending time enjoying touches all over our body, not just those erogenous zones, is very
Perfect.
important. So we're talking about the whole lead up as well as what happens when you're actually engaged in physical touch.
Yes, that's terrific. Exactly. So anticipation build up before you even get to the bedroom or the location where you think you're going to have sex or you want to have sex at, and before you even start touching. So all the anticipatory
Yeah.
pieces, that's priming the pump. I love that. Invest in that. But for both partners, right? So the partner who is like, okay, geez, I wish I was more ready, then that's your homework. And for the partner who wants their partner to be more ready, you could help them along, right? So both
Yes.
could invest in that and
Eh,
getting more ready so
yes.
the more for more enjoyment.
Mhm.
Beautiful. Okay. And so we talked about some difficulties for the woman. So what might be some difficulties for the man? So maybe some erectile dysfunctions. Are there some other things that happen for them?
Yes. So erectile dysfunction has different causes.
Hmm.
And I would say for any man who this is happening with some frequency, I would definitely encourage a medical evaluation with somebody, with a physician who specializes or is very knowledgeable, because often they go to a urologist and they give them a testosterone test and they say, oh, your testosterone's fine, have some Viagra. And, for some people that can work, and it's certainly a very appropriate medication in some contexts. Um, However, there are other things. And for example, I've learned from a knowledgeable physician that sometimes there's a stenosis of the spine, which can cause some erectile dysfunction. So you really want to have that thorough evaluation before you assume, um, it's something that has no physiological basis. So that's an important first step.
Yes.
Um, there are some medications that can interfere with sexual functioning. And then a very common one, if we work through that physiological evaluation and nothing comes up, is looking at anxiety,
Hmm.
because anxiety plays a huge role in all for men and for women in terms of sexuality.
Sure.
Um, it interferes in basically the blood flow. Let's put it
Yeah.
right then and there. There certainly can be performance anxiety, and that comes from many different sources, emotional as well as specifically sexual. Uh, if a man has one, even as few as one situation where his erection goes
Mhm.
away or doesn't arrive, and again, that's a very normal circumstance for that to happen on occasion.
Sure.
He's fatigued, he's had too much alcohol, he's exhausted, the stars just aren't particularly aligned, that time. But then what happens is he becomes anxious about it happening again.
Right.
And so, even though the first time it may have happened would be, totally benign, no real
Mhm.
issue, but now he gets into what we call in the sex therapy world spectatoring, which means watching for his erection. And just as that old adage of a watched pot never boils, well, watched erections do not pop up.
Wow, that's
um,
awesome.
Erections occur in the presence of relaxation and stimulation,
Right.
not anxiety.
Right.
So that's a huge source of problems. And, men can also have a generalized anxiety disorder, not just about sexuality, but they're generally one of those people who worry a lot.
Yeah.
That can also show up in their sexual functioning and be a concern. And then they back away from sexuality because of course it makes them feel very bad about themselves, and
Yeah.
so then they withdraw from sex, and that kind of makes the anxiety just grow.
Yeah. It's like a runaway train at that point.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
That makes sense. So, is there anything that the woman can do to
In
help with
those
that?
situations,
Mhm.
absolutely. Um,
Or the
Actually,
partner who's of it could be the same gender, of course, also, but the
yes,
partner who's
absolutely.
to help the partner who's having the issue.
Yes, and truth be told, for many women who have an orgasm without any penetration, because the way our physiology is that most of the nerve endings are really in the clitoral area and just in the outer third of the vagina. So there's this misconception that for women, it's very important to, have penetrative sex. Not true. Um, and of course, men think it's all about penetrative sex, so they even ignore what I just said, even if they've heard it.
Mhm.
So for women, it it was, or for the partner, it's very important to be reassuring that this is not, the being and all of sexuality for them.
Right.
And the other thing is that erections do naturally ebb and flow during a sexual encounter. So it's important for
Mhm.
both people to be aware of that, which is often not the case because, young men, they're having erections more than they want, right? It's like, how do they get them to go away sometimes? And so, in a natural aging process, when their erection isn't there all the time, it's very, very disconcerting to them.
Sure. And that's so pretty how you said just to be a reassuring partner. So, regardless of which camp you fall under,
Hmm.
right? If you're the spontaneous or the responsive and you're dealing with a partner that's usually the opposite, because that's Mother Nature's way of messing with us. We usually get the opposite in everything, right? Even in sex.
Yes.
Woo-hoo. And then okay, so how do we support each other? How do we have each other's back, right? So if you're more
Hmm.
spontaneous, how can I step up into that? If I'm more of the responsive, how can you help me create that context? If I need more stimulation because my clitoral area is not as responsive, or just for whatever all the reasons, then to play with
Hmm.
all the erogenous zones and all the touching. If I'm the person who's not having as many erections or whatever, just to have that reassurance that other sex is fine too,
Hmm.
and just to reduce that anxiety overall. Beautiful.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
very
Yes.
nice. Excellent. So there was a thing that we kind of touched on this a little bit already, that over time, sex and interest kind of gets smaller or falls to the wayside, or there's less interest in sex. So any thoughts about long-term relationships, what to do about that, how that plays out, and even for elderly couples or older couples, how do we play with these things?
Hmm. Hmm. So I'll start with the last part first in terms of aging, which is that there's a common misconception that couples in their 70s and 80s are not having sex, and not really true. And they certainly are capable. And um, there are natural age-related changes, but it does not mean that sexual satisfaction goes down. Frequency may go down, there's a little bit less desire. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that satisfaction goes down. And most people really do want and need to be touched. And so we can also redefine what is sexuality. Is it just having orgasms? And for many people, that's not true.
Right.
That they may have some level of arousal, but they don't have enough, whatever it is, to climb up to that orgasm. But that still feels good to them.
That's
They
right.
would still define that as sexual. So it's often the case that because, and this will be particularly true for penis owners, is that that erection that used to pop up, all the time, and then most of the time, when it stops popping up so easily in even under stimulation, that freaks them out and they start to withdraw, and they'll withdraw from sex. So we
Right.
need to understand that age related changes are does not get in the way of satisfaction. And on that note, menopause is a really important thing, because for many, many, many women, um, their interest in sex and their ability to get aroused really drops off starting in perimenopause and then
Mhm.
in menopause. And this is another thing that has not been well treated by the medical profession. I think it's only in the last couple years, and that's really new, that we've come around again, because in the 1990s, when there was the Women's Health Initiative, um, research which put a kibosh on hormone replacement therapy. And I, the people I knew at the time in the profession was saying, this is wrong, this is flawed. Uh, Reaction to the study, it was flawed for all sorts of reasons, which I won't go into that, but just that
Mhm.
menopause is something that women have not been served well by the medical profession. So I would encourage women to find somebody who's knowledgeable, a doctor who is knowledgeable about sexuality and menopause and is really up to date with the current research, and to make very thoughtful decisions
Right.
about what they might want to do in terms of hormone replacement. So, super important, super important.
Yes.
Now, to get back to your question, which is just other than the aging process, there's relationships that go on for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, for many more years. And that same level of energy that certainly happens in that early phase of the novel and the excitement, is that there's definitely things that people can do to put some of the pizzazz. And this is where, you want to create some context. What can you do to make that a special evening, if that's kind of what works for
Mhm.
somebody? Is it lighting the candles? Is it, I don't know, eating naked and by the fire, or in scantily clad attire, and having some appetizers and a glass of wine in front of the fire? Is it going away for the weekend? Um, and Surprises. Not everybody likes a surprise, but many people do. Or is it leaving sexy notes for your partner? Is it sending sexy texts along the way? So it takes more awareness to sort of put some of the sparks back in, and create some of the fun. It can be, if people like to role play and have fantasies. I mean, the reason that Victoria's Secret is so popular is because a lot of people really love these visual cues.
Mhm.
And I had one woman once say, "Why should I put on a negligee? You take it off in 30 seconds." And he goes, "Yeah, that's the point.
That's right.
It's worth that 30 seconds." Um,
That's so
so there,
beautiful.
Yeah. So it's really putting in more effort and awareness and thought, as opposed to, it just doesn't happen between the sheets like it might have when you first met each other.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that because you've been together for a long time and because you're aging that you should settle for having mediocre sex life now or a much more modest sex life. You could have whatever sex life you want and just invest in
Yes.
creating that, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Very good. Now, so tell me about chores, being playful. What might get in the way from couples getting on the same page about these things, and how can they use that for the good of this sex life?
Right. So this is just trying to, put some humor, some fun, back into relationships. It can, we all have busy lives, whether it's work or we love our kids, but we don't necessarily love them 24/7. So we can get drained. We don't have the energy at 45 that we had when we were 23. And so the idea of, putting some fun back into the thing, maybe if you're washing dishes, you fling a soap bubble at your partner, or you take the kitchen towel and do one of those whip things,
I
that
get
the kids
whipped.
do all the
Yeah,
time.
not appreciated.
Right. So it's trying to put a little fun and humor and lightness
Sure.
even around just everyday things.
I love that. Yes, so good. Oh my goodness. This was so informative, Deborah. Any other thoughts that come into mind that you think would be very significant for people to know if they're either having some dysfunction and they might not even know they're having dysfunction, if they're struggling having a sexy, satisfying, sexy lifestyle or sex life, and or they're trying to rekindle. So anything on either one of those areas that you want to just add in here?
Sure. There certainly are books, that people can use, but I do want to add a note of caution is that if couples really are struggling, if it's been something that's been a sore point between them for years, it's awkward, but it's really important, I think, to seek out some help from a sex therapist. And I just would encourage people not to hesitate, because some of the things I've shared with you today are what they would learn. And um, and if they're not really perhaps satisfied with how whatever physiological condition they might have is being treated, always or frequently get a second opinion, because I have had so many people come into my office and I'm thinking, I'm just not sure we've gotten to the bottom of this. And I'll refer them to another sexual medicine physician or a sexual medicine physician,
Yeah.
because I'm not sure they saw the first time.
Hmm.
Because I think when it comes to sexuality, people have been grossly underserved. So it's like
Agreed.
continuing to look for what you're struggling with until you really get a good answer.
Love it. Now, what kind of physician is this? Like, because I've never seen them advertised as a sexual medical physician. Is there a specific doctor that people that what is their title or their type of
Yeah, no,
medicine? How
it's
do
a
we
good
find them?
question. It's not an official distinction. So
Right.
these are going to be your gynecologist or your urologist. However, it's how they define.
Mm.
Um, Interestingly enough, there's a wonderful urologist who defines herself as a sexual medicine physician, but she wasn't allowed to put it on the sign that's on the street, and this is
Wow.
not the first person who has been in that situation.
Hmm.
So it's also how they present themselves, because these physicians have gotten extra training, they've paid extra attention, they go to these kinds of conferences.
Perfect.
So it's really how they define themselves, which you could understand more about looking at their website
Right.
or asking questions, when you go to see them, or looking at how they present their biographies on the website,
Right.
and
Other
what
trainings,
their
their
special.
background.
Mhm.
Yep. Excellent. That's
Yes.
great information. Very
Yes.
good. Okay. So, any last words of wisdom?
I think we've done pretty well.
I think so too. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for sharing time with me and all of this wisdom and nuggets so that people can improve and have a much better sex life. Thank you so much for being
Wonderful. You
here.
are welcome.
Thank you. And for their listeners, I will see you at the next one. Bye.